There are moments in the wild when time seems to stand still and instinct takes over. In this video, you'll witness 6 gripping hunting encounters that range from routine stalks to sheer chaos, from calculated tracking to brutal split-second fights for survival. These stories reveal just how quickly a hunter can become the hunted when nature turns unpredictable, unforgiving, and savage. The morning fog clung low over Kodiak Island, thick and damp, muting sound and cloaking everything in a gray hush. 3 experienced hunters, Jake, Clay, and Alan, moved cautiously through a narrow valley, their boots pressing into wet moss, eyes scanning the dense alders ahead. It was late October, prime season for Kodiak bear hunting. The salmon had mostly run their course and the bears were heavy, fattened for winter but still active. The hunters had been tracking a large bear for over 4 hours, following deep tracks and long claw marks on tree trunks. Jake was 34, a skilled outdoorsman who had hunted everything from whitetail in Georgia to elk in Montana. This was his first Kodiak hunt, and he was confident in his gear, a .3006 Springfield bolt-action rifle that had never failed him. He trusted its range, its punch, and its reliability. He led the group, shouldering his rifle, a leather bandolier across his chest, and a steady determination in his stride. Behind him was Clay, 41, a quieter but seasoned Alaskan native who carried a .375 H&H Magnum, knowing full well the kind of force it took to stop a bear of that size. Alan, 38, brought up the rear with a shotgun loaded with slugs, meant more for backup than anything else. When they reached a low ridge, Jake raised a hand to halt the group. Below them, just over 100 yards away, the bear stood in a clearing near a half-frozen stream. It was enormous, thick-shouldered, dark-coated, and utterly focused on tearing apart a salmon carcass. The hunters crouched low, steadying themselves behind cover. Jake took position and braced his rifle across a fallen log. His breath slowed. The bear turned slightly, offering a quartering shot. Jake squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked. The bear flinched and lurched sideways, but it didn't go down. Instead, it lifted its head and locked eyes with them. There was no hesitation. It roared, muscles rippling as it charged uphill with terrifying speed, crashing through the underbrush with a fury that didn't seem natural. Jake worked the bolt quickly, chambering another round. He fired again, this time hitting the bear broadside. Still it came. He fired a third shot, but the click that followed was like thunder in his ears. Whether jammed or empty, the rifle was now useless in his hands. The bear closed the distance in seconds, foam and blood streaking its muzzle, eyes wild with pain and rage. Jake turned to run, but slipped on the wet moss. The beast was on him before he could rise, a force of nature slamming into his side and raking its claws deep into his arm and shoulder. Jake screamed as a bone snapped under the massive paw. Blood sprayed across the ground as the bear pinned him, jaws snapping at his neck. Clay didn't hesitate. He took 2 steps forward and fired. The .375 H&H boomed, sending a heavy round into the bear's left shoulder. The impact staggered the animal, but it didn't fall to the ground. It rose on its hind legs, towering over both men, and let out a guttural roar that seemed to shake the trees. Jake's vision swam with pain. He could barely move, his left arm hanging in tatters. The bear dropped down again, swiping at the air as Clay fired a second shot, this time hitting lower, just behind the front leg. The bear recoiled, coughed, and turned sharply, crashing through the brush and vanishing into the trees. The woods fell into silence except for Jake's shallow, ragged breaths and the fast footsteps of Alan rushing forward. They dragged Jake back from the trail, his face pale, lips blue, his arm a mangled mess of torn muscle and exposed bone. Alan began applying pressure with a field dressing, hands shaking as he tied the tourniquet. Clay stood guard, rifle raised, eyes fixed on the tree line, waiting for any sign that the bear might return. The wind shifted, blood scent lingered. Minutes passed like hours. Finally, they moved. The trek back to their camp took over an hour. Jake was in and out of consciousness, his skin clammy, his breathing shallow. At base, Clay activated their satellite beacon. Within 2 hours, a rescue chopper from Kodiak airlifted Jake to a hospital. The doctors said the damage was severe but survivable. The bear had torn through muscle and fractured the humerus, narrowly missing vital arteries. Emergency surgery saved the arm, though Jake would never have full strength in it again. Back at camp days later, Clay and Alan sat quietly near the fire, reflecting on what had happened. The image of Jake's rifle jamming, his only defense failing at the worst possible moment, played again and again in their minds. The .30 .06, powerful as it was for deer and elk, had simply not been enough to stop a charging Kodiak. Jake's survival had hinged entirely on Clay's firepower and fast reaction. They all knew it. No one spoke it aloud, but the truth settled over them heavily. This wasn't the mainland. These bears didn't bluff. When they came with a violence that few could imagine. Even a clean shot might not stop them in time. The forest had reminded them of a simple, brutal truth. Out here, a second of delay, a single mechanical failure could end everything. Every tool had to be chosen with respect for the animal, the terrain, and the worst-case scenario. Confidence wasn't enough. Only precision, power, and preparation mattered. Jake returned to the island the next year, not to hunt, but to hike the ridges above the same valley. His arm bore the scars of claws and stitches, and his steps were slower now. But he came back because he needed to see it again, to stand where it had happened, not to conquer it, not for vengeance, but to understand it. Because for a moment, beneath that massive paw, he'd understood what it meant to be truly powerless. And when the bear turned and vanished, leaving him broken but alive, he had been given a second chance. And with it came a permanent respect for the sheer, merciless power of Kodiak's giants. The wind howled low across the vast white plains of the northern Canadian Arctic, whipping snow into swirling veils that blurred the horizon. Eric Knudsen moved slowly, methodically across the frozen terrain, his thick insulated boots crunching over crusted ice, his breath forming small clouds inside his neoprene face mask. At 46, he was a veteran Arctic hunter, stoic, patient, and deeply familiar with the silence of the tundra. This was his 5th polar bear hunt, but he had never tracked a bear this large before. Late March still gripped the land in bitter cold, but daylight had returned, painting the snowfields with harsh, brilliant light. Eric's .375 Ruger was slung across his chest, its dark metal glinting in the sun. He had hand-loaded each round with precision. In the Arctic, there was no room for miscalculation. His parka shifted stiffly as he crouched by a cluster of ice-streaked rocks and raised his binoculars. Roughly 150 yards ahead, a hulking figure moved against the snow-dusted ridge. The bear was feeding, its head buried in a mound of ice-stiffened seal fat. Eric exhaled slowly, letting his heartbeat calm. The bear's frame was immense, far larger than most males he'd seen. Its fur was a yellow-streaked white, thick with layered insulation. Even from a distance, he could see the bulk of its shoulders and the wide span of its neck. He dropped the binoculars and unslung his rifle. Settling into a prone position behind a ridge, he steadied the weapon on his pack and aimed just behind the bear's shoulder. When the reticle stopped swaying, he squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed like a thunderclap across the frozen land. Eric quickly chambered the next round. Through the scope, he saw the bear flinch, barely. It rose, turning its head toward the sound, then started to walk in his direction. It was not running, not charging yet, but its pace was steady. Ears pinned back, eyes fixed forward. Eric fired again, this time aiming lower toward the chest. The bullet struck true, a puff of fur and blood visible through the scope. But the bear didn't falter. It began to move faster now, its wide paws thudding into the snow as it advanced. Eric knew what was coming. The wind gusted into his face, cold, slicing through layers of insulation. He steadied the Ruger and fired a third shot into the ribs, quickly followed by a fourth. The massive beast stumbled slightly but didn't stop. Now, within 100 yards, the bear lowered its head and broke into a full charge. Eric's hands moved on instinct. A 5th round struck the neck. The bear faltered but pushed forward, roaring, closing the distance with terrifying speed. Eric rose to one knee, firing again as the creature reached 50 yards. The 6th round hit the shoulder joint, slowing it, but still not bringing it down. Snow sprayed into the air as the bear plowed through a drift, teeth bared, eyes full of fury and pain. Eric remained frozen in place, legs braced, lungs burning. The world narrowed to the final moment, the last shot. He raised the rifle one more time and fired his 7th round directly into the bear's lower neck, just beneath the jaw. The impact was immediate. The bear stumbled mid-stride, legs buckling under its massive weight, and it crashed into the snow with a thud that Eric felt through his boots. A cloud of powder rose, then settled, leaving only silence. Eric remained motionless, the echo of the final shot ringing in his ears. His hands trembled slightly as he lowered the rifle, eyes fixed on the lifeless body just 30 yards from where he stood. Cautiously, he stepped forward, rifle still at the ready. Each step was slow, deliberate. Only when he saw the thick blood pooling in the snow and the still rise of the massive rib cage did he let himself breathe again. The bear was enormous. Easily over 1,200 pounds, its fur thick and matted with blood where the bullets had struck. Its face, even in death, bore a kind of primal force. Eric stared for a long moment, both awed and shaken. It had taken 7 rounds, each one deadly, and yet the beast had nearly reached him. Kneeling beside the creature, he placed a hand on its side. The body was still warm beneath the thick coat. His own adrenaline had left him breathless, knees weak as the enormity of what had just happened sank in. A single misstep, a delay in reloading, a poorly placed shot, any of those things would have ended the day differently. Eric had hunted all over the north, moose in the Yukon, wolves in Nunavut, but this had been different. This wasn't just skill and planning, this had been survival. The polar bear had come at him with a relentless determination, impervious to pain, its thick hide absorbing punishment like armor. It wasn't rage, it was primal instinct, challenge and answer. He set up a small marker for the extraction team and hiked several miles back to the snowmobile. Even hours later, his body was sore from the tension, his pulse still elevated from the close encounter. The icy wind returned as dusk fell, sweeping across the open flats, but Eric didn't feel the cold, not yet. Back at base camp, he sat alone beside the propane heater, his rifle resting in the corner, snow still clinging to the sling. He replayed the attack in his mind, the advancing shape, the glint of the bear's eyes, the thunder of his own rifle. The Arctic had always demanded respect, but today it had reminded him how narrow the margin between hunter and hunted could be. The meat would be shared with the Inuit village nearby as tradition demanded. The hide, preserved and honored. But more than anything, the memory would linger, a slow, powerful force charging through the silence, refusing to fall until the last possible second. Out there in that frozen expanse, Eric had come face to face with something few men ever would, the terrifying resilience of the Arctic giant. The air was thick with humidity as morning broke over the rolling hills of central Texas. Fog clung to the low pastures and pockets of live oak and cedar, softening the jagged terrain of hill country. Carter Wilkes, a 39-year-old executive from Atlanta, sat quietly inside a well-insulated elevated blind, sipping lukewarm coffee from a thermos, eyes fixed on the tree line below. He wasn't new to hunting, but this trip was a step into unfamiliar territory. A luxury-guided experience on a sprawling private ranch where trail cameras had caught glimpses of a rare velvet-racked whitetail buck, estimated at over 190 inches. The animal had become the talk of the ranch. Massive-bodied, heavy-framed, and still in velvet, unusual for late summer, it was a ghost among the brush. Carter had arrived 2 days earlier with top-end gear, including a custom .300 Win Mag, dialed in for precision. Though this wasn't his first whitetail hunt, the stakes felt higher here. It wasn't about meat or sport. It was about claiming something elusive, even mythical. Just after dawn, movement in the low light caught his eye. The buck emerged slowly from behind a mesquite cluster, tall tines coated in velvet like soaked felt, glistening slightly from morning dew. Its body was thick and powerful, muscles visible beneath the sleek coat. Carter steadied the rifle on the shooting rail, heart pounding. The buck turned broadside. The shot cracked across the silence. The deer jolted, stumbled, then bolted into a wall of dense cedar. Carter saw a splash of red as it disappeared, low behind the shoulder, but the animal didn't drop. He climbed down and waited near the trailhead until his guide, Luis, a seasoned 55-year-old, pulled up in the all-terrain vehicle. They found blood within minutes, a thick, dark trail threading between the cedar trunks. The ground was rocky, the brush sharp and tangled. The buck had run deep. They moved slowly, rifles raised, stepping carefully between the twisted trunks, scanning every shadow. The trail remained strong, but showed signs of erratic movement, quick turns, broken branches, sudden stops. The buck was hurt, but not done. About 30 minutes in, they entered a narrow chute of brush, visibility down to barely 10 yards. The path curved slightly, hemmed in by dry cedar walls, and Luis raised a hand to slow them. Carter's breathing was shallow, the air hot and heavy, his rifle barrel slick with sweat. They paused at a small clearing, just a few feet wide. Then everything exploded. From the left, a sudden blur of tan and velvet erupted from the undergrowth. The buck, eyes wide and wild, charged straight through the gap, closing the 10-yard distance in less than a second. Its antlers were lowered, thick beams pointing like dull blades. Carter instinctively raised his rifle and fired, but the shot went wide as the buck slammed into him with brutal force. He went down hard, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs. The antlers tore into his thigh as he hit the dirt, pain blooming up his leg like fire. Blood soaked through his pants almost instantly. The buck spun, hooves scraping rock, prepared to charge again, dazed and driven by raw survival instinct. Luis stepped in with terrifying speed, firing his lever-action .45 70 from just 5 feet away. The shot hit the buck in the chest, dropping it mid-turn. It crumpled sideways, twitching once, then lay still among the rocks and cedar needles. Silence fell again, broken only by Carter's gasps. Luis knelt, applying pressure to the wound with his bandana. The gash was deep, ragged, bleeding heavily, but had missed the femoral artery by inches. Carter's leg throbbed with each heartbeat as they wrapped it tightly and began the slow, painful walk back to the ATV. Back at the lodge, the mood was somber. The buck lay in the skinning shed, its antlers smeared with dried blood and fragments of brush. The staff whispered, shaken by what had happened. Carter sat on a stretcher, pale and worn, the bandaged leg elevated, eyes locked on the mounted velvet rack resting against the far wall. The thrill of the hunt had been replaced with something quieter, something far more personal. It wasn't just adrenaline or pain, it was clarity. The buck had done what it had to do. Wounded, cornered, and disoriented, it had turned from prey into weapon, using its last burst of strength to defend itself. That charge wasn't madness. It was instinct, a raw, desperate decision in the face of death. And in that moment, Carter understood the thin line between hunter and hunted. They kept the antlers, mounted the rack with care and reverence, velvet still intact, its weight heavy with meaning. But Carter kept something else, an angry red scar stitched tight from hip to knee, a reminder that even the most predictable animal could become a lethal force when pushed. For all the ranch's comfort, for all the gear and planning, there had been no preparing for that single second when everything went wrong. The moment the animal turned, the instant instincts took control. That's what Carter would remember. Not the score, not the photo, not the trophy above the fireplace, but the sound of hooves thundering through the brush. The burst of pain, the shock of being knocked backward by something he'd come to conquer. The velvet buck had died, but it had left its mark. And Carter, once a hunter with goals carved neatly on a checklist, returned home with a new understanding. One earned not through aim or patience, but through chaos, fear, and survival. In the wild, nothing was promised, and no creature, no matter how small or graceful, could be underestimated. Even a whitetail, when cornered and bleeding, could charge with the fury of something much greater. And that truth was carved deeper than the scar. A heavy mist clung to the hills of southern Poland, curling through the ancient oak forests like breath from the earth itself. It was late November and the air was thick with the scent of damp leaves, churned soil, and wood smoke from distant villages. In these parts, the driven boar hunt was more than tradition. It was ritual passed down through generations. Men came not just for the meat or the challenge, but for the moment when instinct and action blurred in the hush of the woods. Marek Nowak, 43, stood at the edge of a narrow game trail posted quietly among the gnarled trunks. He was a lifelong hunter, calm and methodical, trusted by locals for his sharp eye and steady hand. In his arms rested a 9.3 by 62 Mauser, heavy, accurate, and built for dense cover and hard targets. He had hunted red deer in the Carpathians and wolves in the Far East, but boars were different. They didn't run like deer. They crashed. They didn't spook like hares. They fought back. The line of beaters and dogs began their slow push through the thickets behind him, shouting and clapping, letting loose short, sharp barks that echoed across the forest. Marek narrowed his gaze toward the bend in the trail, where visibility was barely 30 meters. The trees were skeletal this time of year. Their bare limbs stretched upward, but the underbrush was still thick. His gloves were damp with cold, and condensation clung to the rifle's matte barrel. Minutes passed, then came the movement. A crackle of brush, a flurry of rustling leaves. Through the haze, a dark blur erupted from the woods, a sounder of wild boars, muscles rippling, hooves pounding into the loam. They darted across the trail, black shapes disappearing between trees in a matter of seconds. But one didn't flee. At the rear came a giant, gray-backed, scarred, a beast twice the size of the others. It moved slower, deliberately, as if weighing its options. Its tusks gleamed dully, one chipped, the other yellowed and thick. As it reached the trail, it paused, looking toward Merrick's stand with cold, calculating eyes. And then it turned, not away, but toward him. Merrick raised the Mauser, already bracing against the trunk behind him. He exhaled slowly, sighting the boar's broad shoulder as it began to charge, earth flying from under its hooves. He squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out like a hammer blow through the trees. The bullet struck, but not square, just above the front leg, grazing the thick hide. Blood misted, but the boar didn't even flinch. It came on faster now, low and direct, grunting with fury. Merrick stepped back, trying to steady for another shot, but his boot caught beneath a twisted root. The forest floor rushed up. He hit hard, his rifle clattering to the side, breath torn from his lungs. Pain exploded across his back. He scrambled, trying to reach for the weapon, but the boar was almost on him. 20 meters. 10. Its eyes were locked, its body hunched forward, ready to drive those tusks into anything that stood or lay in its path. Just as Merrick rolled to the side, a thunderous blast echoed from his right. Another hunter, Piotr, positioned further down the line, had heard the commotion and seen the blur of movement through the mist. His shot struck the boar square in the ribs. The animal let out a strangled groan, stumbled mid-charge, then collapsed onto its side, sliding forward until it came to a dead stop less than a meter from Merrick's boots. The forest stilled. Merrick lay on the ground, chest heaving, heart hammering in his ears. He reached slowly for the Mauser, more out of instinct than need. The rifle was cold, slick with dew and mud. He sat up and looked at the massive body beside him. Its hide was torn, the tusks buried slightly in the dirt, eyes half closed but still open. Steam rose from the warm blood pooling beneath it, already beginning to cool in the damp air. Piotr approached, rifle still raised, eyes scanning the brush in case others had circled back. But there was nothing, only silence and the drifting mist. Later, when the drive ended and the group gathered around the fallen boar, they examined the carcass closely. Scars crisscrossed its flanks. One ear was split down the middle. The tusks bore signs of past breaks and regrowth. Across the thick hide were ridges of hardened scar tissue, proof of old wounds, none clean, none small. This was no ordinary boar. This one had lived through fights with dogs, with hunters, with other boars. It had charged before and it had survived. Merrick stood stiffly, sore from the fall, his leg aching where he'd landed hard against a rock. But he said little. There was no boasting, no laughter, just quiet nods and long stares. Even among seasoned men, the weight of what nearly happened hung heavy in the air. The boar had not fled. It had assessed its enemy and chosen to fight. And in that moment, it had nearly won. It was no mindless beast. It was something else. Resilient, deliberate, terrifying in its sheer refusal to back down. That evening back at the lodge, as rifles were cleaned and boots dried near the stove, the story began to take shape. Not just of a successful drive, but of the moment when tradition clashed with raw unpredictability. A moment when one of the most dangerous animals in the European wild reminded them all what it meant to face death head-on. Merrick would carry bruises for weeks, maybe longer, but what lingered far beyond the pain was the memory of the animal's eyes. Defiant, unafraid, determined to end the fight on its own terms. It was a scarred warrior, shaped by years of surviving, battling, and charging through every threat it had ever faced. This time it had fallen, but not easily, and not without a fight that would be remembered for years to come. The cold wind blew steadily through the conifers as mist drifted over the river in Ontario's remote backcountry. In the early hours of the morning, the air was sharp and filled with the scent of damp earth, pine, and something else. Something older, wilder. Jake Harper, a 36-year-old electrician from Thunder Bay, moved carefully across the uneven terrain, flanked by two longtime friends and fellow hunters, Liam and Travis. They had been tracking a black bear since dawn, following wide prints and tufts of fur snagged on tree bark, signs that the animal had traveled along the water's edge during the night. Jake wasn't new to hunting, but this trip felt different. The terrain was more unforgiving than he expected. Moss-covered rocks, slick mud, and dense thickets slowed their movement as the sound of the river grew louder. He carried a .308 Winchester, reliable and familiar, with a scope dialed in for mid-range accuracy. His pack was light, but his steps were cautious. Every footfall along the rocky banks had to be measured. One misstep here could mean a long fall or worse. They had caught sight of the bear only once that morning, a glimpse of a thick, dark shape disappearing into the undergrowth near a bend in the river. From the tracks, it was big, maybe 300 pounds or more. Bears in this region were known for their size and wariness, and this one was moving fast, sticking close to cover, never straying too far from the river's roar. By midday, the hunters found themselves near a deep pool where the water churned violently between two steep rock walls. It was a narrow choke point in the river, and just across the far bank, Liam spotted movement, a flash of black fur low in the trees. The bear had stopped. It stood roughly 40 yards away, turning slowly as if sensing something, unaware of the three men watching from across the water. Jake moved forward, climbing out onto a wide, flat stone that jutted out over the river's edge. It was slick with spray from the water crashing below, but it offered the clearest shot. He dropped to one knee, rifle shouldered, breath slowing. The bear shifted again, stepping into a clearer patch of brush. It wasn't broadside, but close enough. Jake squeezed the trigger halfway. Then everything changed. The bear looked straight at him. In one sudden, terrifying moment, it turned, not to run, but to charge. It barreled down the slight incline toward the water, its eyes locked on Jake's position. Startled, Jake shifted back to adjust his aim, but his boot slipped. The moss and water-slick rock offered no grip. He lost balance and fell hard onto his back, the impact jarring the rifle from his hands. It skidded to the side as Jake gasped for air, trying to right himself, but the stone was too smooth and the angle too steep. The bear was closing the distance fast. Jake scrambled, boots slipping, hands searching for the rifle. His fingers found the cold steel just as the bear reached the edge, claws scraping over rock, teeth bared, a low growl vibrating through the air. Jake raised the rifle with both hands, pain shooting up his wrist from the fall, and tried to aim even as water sprayed his face and adrenaline blurred his vision. The bear was nearly on him. It reared slightly, front legs rising, ready to strike. Its paw came down in a blur, raking across Jake's left arm. The impact felt like being hit with a hatchet. A white-hot pain burst through him as blood began to flow. He fired. The shot echoed across the river, loud and sharp. The bullet struck the bear's shoulder at close range, knocking it sideways. It stumbled, snarled, then turned and bounded back up the bank, crashing through the trees and disappearing into the thick brush. Jake lay there for several seconds, chest heaving, blood soaking through his jacket, the rifle still raised in trembling hands. Water from the river soaked his clothes, seeping through every layer. The cold was immediate and biting. Liam and Travis were already rushing to him, voices lost in the roar of the current, eyes wide with alarm as they saw the gash on his arm and the scattered gear. With their help, Jake made it back up the bank. His arm throbbed violently, the cut deep but clean enough to wrap quickly. The wound had missed the artery, but the muscle was torn, and he'd need stitches. His legs were scraped and bruised from the rocks, and his ribs ached where he'd landed. Back at camp, they built a fire and stripped away his wet gear, the heat a welcome relief after the numbing chill. Jake stared at the flames. The memory of the bear's charge burned into his mind. It hadn't hesitated, it hadn't bluffed. It had come with the same unstoppable momentum as the river beside them, wild, brutal, and merciless. That single step onto the slick rock, that small loss of footing, had nearly cost him everything. Later that night, when the pain dulled and the fire burned low, Jake sat in silence, staring at the bandaged arm. He thought about how easily the river could have swept him away, how quickly the bear had turned, how close he had come to slipping into nothingness between the current and claws. The wilderness didn't offer second chances. Every second mattered. Every step, every trigger pull, every breath could tip the scale between survival and tragedy. They never saw the bear again, and they didn't go back for it. They left the blood-stained stones behind, a reminder that the wild didn't always allow closure. Some stories ended with a shot, others ended with a scar. And Jake knew this story, the one written at the river's edge, would stay with him far longer than any trophy ever could. Frost coated the underbrush like thin white lace as the first light of morning spread across the boreal woods of northern Maine. The air was still, sharp with the bite of mid-October cold, and every step through the mossy spruce floor released the faint scent of pine sap and damp soil. Nick Ellison and Jared Pike moved slowly through the timber, boots muffled on thick duff and old pine needles. For two lifelong friends from southern Maine, this was more than just a hunt. It was a dream they'd waited years to realize. They'd drawn a bull moose permit together in the spring, a rare chance, and had spent months planning every detail. By the fourth day of their week-long hunt, they had spotted signs of a large bull near a series of beaver ponds tucked deep in the forest. Tracks the size of dinner plates, fresh rubs on tamarack trunks, and the musky scent of rut told them the bull was still nearby. They'd camped out in a small canvas tent not far from the marsh, and this morning they'd moved in under the cover of darkness, creeping into a thick stand of spruce on the downwind side of the water. Nick, 38, carried his trusted .300 Win Mag, the same rifle that had dropped a bear 3 years prior. Rugged, accurate, and never a problem, until today. Jared, 2 years older and the quieter of the two, held a .338 Federal, powerful and simple, perfect for close-range work in thick cover. Both men wore heavy wool layers and blaze-orange caps, their breath hanging in the cold as they moved deeper into the timber. At the edge of a clearing, Nick paused. A deep grunt echoed from beyond the pond, low and guttural, followed by the faint crackle of brush. Jared knelt beside a stump, eyes scanning the tree line, while Nick raised a fiberglass horn and gave a long, nasal cow call. The sound lingered, rising through the mist, and then silence. Then a shape appeared in the tamarack. The bull, massive, slow-moving. Its rack was wide and heavy-palmed, catching the weak light as it advanced through the scrub. It moved with deliberate power, every step measured. Frost broke from its legs as it pushed forward, black eyes locked on the direction of the call. Nick steadied his rifle, dropped to a knee, and exhaled. The crosshairs found the bull's chest. The moment was perfect. Broadside, close, calm. He squeezed the trigger. Click. No recoil, no boom, just the sickening sound of failure. His breath caught. Panic surged through him as the bull paused, ears twitching. Nick worked the bolt hard, ejecting the dud, but as he slammed the next round forward, the bolt wouldn't close. Resistance, grinding, the mechanism refused to lock. He tried again, still stuck. Then it hit him. That morning in the dark, he'd slipped on a wet rock while crossing a shallow creek. He'd fallen hard, rifle first. Though he'd wiped it off and thought nothing of it, frozen mud must have worked into the action, locking the bolt just when he needed it most. The bull's gaze shifted. One heavy hoof lifted as it began to turn. Jared, crouched 10 yards away, had already raised his rifle. But from his angle, tree trunks obscured the vitals. He didn't shoot. He held steady, waiting, but the window was closing. Nick dropped the useless rifle to his side and did the only thing he could think of. He cupped his hands and gave another cow call, shaky, high-pitched, full of desperation. The sound cracked the air, uneven and frantic. The bull stopped, just for a second. It turned its head slightly, hesitated, and stood there broadside again, muscles tight, breath steaming from its nose. Jared didn't wait. His rifle cracked, loud and final. The bull jerked once, staggered, then dropped straight down, legs folding beneath it like a house of cards. For several moments, nothing moved. Nick sat back on his heels, breath ragged, heart thundering in his ears. Jared lowered his rifle, shoulders slumping with the release of tension. The spruce trees stood still, frost beginning to melt where the sun touched their branches. The moose lay motionless near the pond's edge, massive and silent. They approached slowly, cautiously, rifles at the ready, but the shot had been clean, tight through the lungs. The bull hadn't taken a step. Up close, the animal's sheer size was staggering. The antlers were even larger than expected, deep palms, thick tines, velvet long gone. Its chest rose like a barrel, and the wound bled steadily into the mossy soil. Nick stood in silence, one hand still clutching the useless rifle, the other shaking slightly. He'd been seconds from disaster. A single misfire, compounded by one unnoticed patch of frozen grit, had nearly cost them everything. In the woods, even a reliable rifle wasn't enough. Conditions, care, and luck. All of it had to work together. Jared clapped a hand on his shoulder without a word, and they got to work. The field dressing took hours. The bull was massive, and quartering it was slow, meticulous work. Blood warmed their gloves while steam rose from the carcass as the cold air settled back in. They packed the meat into game bags and hung it for the night, knowing they would need the following day to haul it out. Yet they didn't mind. The hard work felt like a reward, not a burden. That night, back at camp, the fire crackled under a cast-iron pan sizzling with backstrap. They sat in silence at first, letting the heat soak into their bones. Eventually, Nick cleaned the rifle, scraping out the frozen mud and wiping the bolt clean, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't speak, but he didn't need to. He'd remember that moment forever, the stillness, the click, the split second of helplessness, and the sight of the bull pausing just long enough for Jared to take the shot. Some hunts ended with a roar of triumph. Others ended in quiet relief. This one ended with a misfire and a reminder that in the wild, nothing is ever certain, and every shot depends not just on skill, but on every detail leading up to it.